Out beyond the last patrol routes, a relay station in the Kuiper Belt goes silent on schedule. Not from damage, not from fear, from paperwork. Cassian Rook is the engineer on duty when the silence order hits. Perfectly timed, perfectly legal, and perfectly wrong. Messages arrive late, supply windows slip into forever, and the station's own logs start showing signs that someone is editing time itself. Then Seren Keth arrives, an alien data specialist who can see the cut marks in the transmissions like scars. She doesn't say the station is broken. She says it is being removed from the story, one clean procedure at a time. Because if a war can control what people hear, it can control what people believe. And if Cassian and Seren try to speak, they won't just be punished. They'll be rewritten. A soft chime pulsed at the airlock. Once, then again. Cassian Rook froze mid-step. Because quiet Meridian Relay never took visitors without warning. The indicator on the door flashed a line that made his stomach tighten. Manual entry, no docking request. Ship time was nearing midnight when he had started the relay cycle. Cassian was shift engineer and duty lead of Quiet Meridian Relay, a small station anchored on the Kuiper Rim corridor. Outside the viewport, the Kuiper dark looked calm. But inside the hull, calm never lasted. Fans pushed recycled air through warm ducts, and the station smelled of hot metal and disinfectant. Cassian moved by habit, not hurry, because hurry wasted oxygen and attention. He watched radiator numbers the way a farmer watched clouds, waiting for the first sign of a bad turn. Deep space did not forgive heat. If the panels could not shed it, the station cooked itself from the inside. Slow and quiet, the station could look fine on paper right up until the moment it was not. Cassian forced his eyes away from the airlock and back to the communications rack. The queue had blinked a dispatch from Earth Union Strategic Command. 3 days late, which was normal out here. What was not normal was the second item, stamped with today's signature down to the minute. It was a hush writ, effective immediately. The order did not argue, explain, or negotiate. Cassian reread it twice, because orders did not beat physics unless someone helped them. Then he heard the airlock chime again and felt the pressure of time settle into his chest. If someone boarded without a request, they were either desperate or authorized to ignore consent. And if the hush writ had arrived with no delay, someone close to his station was already reaching into his world. Cassian pulled up Ghost Ledger, the official transmission log. It should have been dull and messy, full of retries and small faults. But tonight it was too neat. Retries were missing. Minor errors were corrected too quickly, and one checksum mismatch was marked fixed in under 1 second, even though this rack could not do that. He opened the raw trace beneath the ledger. It did not match the polished entries, and the seams felt human, not accidental, as if someone had rewritten the record after the window closed. Cassian wanted to call it sabotage, but he held the word back, because words could be used like restraints. He tried a simple query on the command channel. The interface accepted his login and refused his outgoing packet. A calm line appeared on the screen. It said outbound traffic was suspended under hush writ. It instructed him to comply and await further instruction. Cassian whispered, "Await what?" Behind a curtain, technician Jalen Price slept in a bunk. Cassian did not wake him yet, because sleep was fuel in a habitat that ran on thin margins. He opened a panel above the rack and let warm air wash over his face. He traced cables for fresh tool marks and found none. The absence felt deliberate, because only a person could make tampering look like routine. Cassian closed the panel and saved a private note to local storage. He placed the raw trace and the clean ledger side by side. Proof that lived off the network. Then the airlock chime sounded again, closer in his mind than in the hallway. Cassian switched to the external camera feed. A woman stood inside the lock with her helmet off. Her hair was dark and tied back, and her skin carried a faint metallic tint under the light. She raised her hands so the camera could see them. She did not smile. She waited like someone used to being judged. Cassian opened the inner door only a crack and kept his voice level. Cassian said, "Name and role?" The woman answered without stepping forward. Seren said, "Seren Keth, Data Normalization Specialist." Keth Meridian Envoy Office. I am cleared for your station. Cassian kept the door narrow. Cassian said, clearance does not arrive unannounced. Who sent you? Seren held his stare. Seren said, your own logs sent me, not the ones you can see. Cassian stepped aside but did not drop his guard. Cassian said, one step in, slow. Seren entered with measured movements, as if gravity itself was a negotiation. Cassian sealed the inner door, checked the lock readout twice, then led her to the work table near the communications rack. He pointed to a line on the floor and kept his tone controlled. Cassian said, past that line is core access. You do not cross it. Seren nodded once. Seren said, I will not touch your cores. I only need your raw traces. She set a small storage wafer on the table. It looked ordinary, and that made Cassian distrust it more, not less. Seren said, it rode in on a sanitation update. It should not exist. Cassian did not plug it in yet. Cassian said, tell me what it holds. Seren answered with careful precision. Seren said, raw packet stream. Your ghost ledger has been cut. Someone spliced in clean segments. Your station looks healthy on paper. It is not. Cassian felt his throat tighten. He had reached the same conclusion alone, but hearing it from her made it real in a different way. Cassian said, why come in person? Seren said, because the editor sits on the network. If I speak on it, I vanish. If you speak, you vanish. In person, we compare what is real. Cassian used an isolated reader and opened the wafer. The stream showed gaps where messages should have been, time stamps falling between official windows, and corruption sitting in one band like deliberate burns. Seren pointed without touching the screen. Seren said, the cut repeats every cycle. They erase just enough to numb you. Cassian compared the stream with his own raw trace. The seams aligned, and the answer in his body arrived before the words did. Cassian said, what did we hear that scares them? Seren kept her face still, but her eyes stayed alert. Seren said, I do not know the content. I know the behavior. Editors cut what changes outcomes. Cassian studied her as a partner, not a visitor. Cassian said, who is doing it? Seren hesitated, then chose plain words. Seren said, a directorate on your side. A part of command that treats truth like cargo. They will call it morale. Cassian glanced at the station clock. The next window was in 9 hours. Close enough to plan and far enough to be stopped. Overhead, a fan changed pitch as it hunted for load, and Cassian suddenly distrusted every small sound. He kept his next question softer. Cassian said, why you? Why take this risk for my station? Seren's gaze dropped to her hands. Faint scars lined her knuckles. Old and clean. Seren said, because I have seen what silence does. On your side and mine. It turns people into numbers. Cassian did not reach for comfort, because he did not know her well enough. He simply said what mattered. Cassian said, we need proof that cannot be rewritten. Seren nodded. Seren said, then you stop relying on Ghost Ledger. You use reality, inventory, sensor caches, serial numbers, anything the network cannot polish. Cassian thought of Jalen Price asleep behind the curtain. Jalen would argue, but Jalen would also count bolts until dawn. Cassian said, we audit supplies. If the station is being starved, that is proof. Seren did not pretend it was safe. Seren said, proof that does not live in the ledger, and proof that will make you a target. Cassian held her gaze. Cassian said, that may already be true. Either way, we do not wait. Cassian woke Jalen Price with a tap on the bunk frame. Jalen blinked, then sat up fast when he saw Seren, hand going to the locker by reflex. Cassian kept it simple. Cassian said, boots on. Inventory check now, questions later. Jalen frowned but trusted Cassian's tone. He pulled on boots and followed. They walked the supply corridor under harsh work lights while fans hummed above and pipes ticked with thermal strain. Cassian opened the sealant cabinet, and a case listed full was half empty. Jalen stared at the gap and swore under his breath. They moved to filters. A cartridge marked new had been refurbished, scrubbed clean, and relabeled. Seren watched without comment, letting the evidence speak as Cassian recorded serial numbers to local storage. They crossed to a crate labeled cold-skin radiator tiles. Cassian cut the tape, lifted the lid, and found foam and air inside. A shipment made for show. Jalen looked ready to punch the wall. Cassian steadied him with a hand on the shoulder. Because panic was expensive in a sealed habitat. Seren exhaled slowly. Seren said, "They are starving your station. Not fast enough to notice. Just fast enough to fail on schedule." Cassian checked the emergency oxygen cabinet and saw one canister missing. The missing weight felt heavier than the empty crate. Jalen stared at the slot, anger tightening his jaw. Jalen said, "Who steals breath?" Seren said, "People who want you to leave. Or people who want you to die without a bullet." Cassian shut the cabinet with care and forced his voice level. He told them to document everything with photos, sensor reads, and serial numbers, then keep it off the network. A system bulletin chimed on the nearest terminal, reminding them to comply with hush writ. It cited their local temperature sensor by name. Seren leaned close to Cassian. Seren said, "That bulletin was written for you. Someone is watching your air." Cassian saved the bulletin and the sensor snapshot. He turned to Jalen and kept his words tight. Cassian said, "No one says a word on comms. Not even to the medic. Not one hint." Then he checked the radar view for their perimeter. Cassian pictured the next cycle without new radiator tiles. The panels would run hotter. One tile would blister, then another, and the station would look fine on paper until it did not. Out here, heat killed quietly, and it always looked like bad luck. Jalen lowered his voice. Jalen said, "If command did this, why not finish it?" Cassian said, "Because accidents are easier to sell than murders." Seren kept her hands off the network terminal. Seren said, "You need a way to speak that does not look like speaking. A drift beacon can carry a cache as if it were debris reporting its own temperature. It will not convince command. It will convince anyone else who is listening." Cassian nodded once. Cassian said, "We build it from what we have. We load the raw proof and push it out before the next window closes." A faint transponder blinked at the edge of detection, strengthened, and stabilized. The label read, "Greywake Courier." But there was no docking request and no handshake. Seren watched the track line form. Seren said, "That is not supply. It is a question." Cassian felt the station's warmth and thin air and pictured an office-down son deciding his story was inconvenient. He pictured words like compliant and expendable, stamped and filed. He looked at Seren and chose a sentence he could live with. Cassian said, "I choose to keep the relay honest, even if it costs me the relay." The Greywake signal flared once and vanished. As if switched off, Cassian saved the radar cache to local storage and met Seren's eyes. Cassian said, "That was their first knock." Seren nodded once. Seren said, "It will not be the last." A few hours after the silence order locked their antenna, quiet Meridian Relay felt smaller. Cassian Rook kept his voice low as he read a new directive from Earth Union Strategic Command. While Seren Keth stood beside the console, eyes on the raw trace rather than the polished log. The directive repeated the same phrase in 3 different sections. Maintain radio silence to avoid revealing position. Cassian had heard that line before, usually paired with a route change or a handoff to another relay. He scrolled for the handoff and found nothing. No alternate station was assigned. No revised schedule appeared. No orbital adjustment was offered. The order asked for silence, but left the relay standing in the same spotlight. Seren tapped the edge of the screen with a gloved knuckle, careful not to touch the network controls. Seren said, "If they feared detection, they would move the burden. They would not leave a lamp lit and tell it to stop shining." Cassian frowned. Cassian said, "Maybe they think the lamp is already dark." Seren shook her head. Seren said, "The station still radiates heat. It still pings navigation beacons. Silence in speech does not erase a body." Cassian opened a diagnostic view for the antenna array. Transmit power was set to standby. as if a hand had turned the key and kept it in a pocket. A warning icon blinked beside the control tied to Hush Writ. He tried to submit a variance report, the kind engineers sent when orders collided with physics. The interface accepted his draft and returned it with a single sentence that felt like a door shutting. It said, "Request recorded, no outbound delivery authorized." Jalen Price paced behind them, boots soft on the rubber deck. Jalen said, "That is not security, that is theater." Cassian kept his eyes on the time stamps. The directive had arrived without delay, like the first silence order, and the attached authentication looked too pristine, as if it had been created inside the relay instead of traveling through space. Seren lowered her voice. Seren said, "An order that outruns distance is not an order. It is a hand on your throat." Cassian forced himself to stay practical. Cassian said, "If this is staged, what are they staging for?" Seren looked toward the equipment bay, where the station lived or died on parts and patience. Seren said, "They are staging an accident. An accident needs witnesses who cannot speak." Cassian heard the station in that moment. Fans, pumps, the faint tick of cooling pipes. He imagined a report written in warm offices, describing failure as bad luck. Then he imagined his own name as a footnote. Jalen stopped pacing. Jalen said, "Who writes that report?" Seren answered with restraint. Seren said, "Not a person you will meet. A desk that owns the narrative." Cassian saved the directive to local storage, then pulled up the raw communications cache Seren had brought. The clean log claimed the station had complied instantly, but the raw trace showed Cassian had not even been awake when compliance was marked complete. Cassian glanced at Seren. Cassian said, "Someone pressed yes for me." Seren met his eyes. Seren said, "That is why I came. Your station is being edited in real time." Cassian leaned back, feeling the ache between his shoulders. He wanted a human voice from command. A pause, a hesitation, anything that proved this was not just a machine stamping authority. He pictured his father on the inner worlds, reading a sanitized bulletin and believing it. The thought stung because it was what the system relied on. Cassian looked at Jalen, then back to Seren, and chose the only direction that still made sense. Cassian said, "Inventory is proof, but proof is not enough if we cannot deliver it." Seren nodded once. Seren said, "Then we prepared two paths. One for survival, one for truth." Cassian exhaled. Cassian said, "Start with survival. If the station dies, truth dies with it." Cold crept in the way water did. Through seams, through habits, through the hours. Cassian checked the thermal map and saw blue spreading across the crew corridor. Even while heaters worked, because the power margin was shrinking. A battery bank reported degraded capacity. Not catastrophic, just enough to matter at the wrong time. Radiator panels ran hotter than they should for the load they carried. And waste heat had nowhere generous to go. Cassian traced the cause to a valve that should have been replaced last month. The replacement had been on the manifest, but the crate had arrived full of foam, and the foam did not keep a station alive. Jalen sat on the deck with the valve assembly in his lap. His tools lay out like a surgeon's kit. Jalen said, "I can keep it alive. I cannot make it young again." Seren watched the pressure readouts. Her face stayed composed, but her breathing shortened in a way Cassian could not ignore. Cassian remembered the missing emergency oxygen canister with a quiet anger that had nowhere to go. Cassian pulled up the station budget for power. There was no room left for comfort, only life support, minimal lighting, pumps, and the communications rack sitting in standby like a gag in a mouth. Cassian said, "We shut down Anchor Bay module at night. We move bunks into the work corridor. Heat one spine, not the whole body." Jalen stared at him. Jalen said, "That is where people live." Cassian said, "It is where people sleep. And sleeping cold is better than waking up not breathing." Seren spoke without judgment. Seren said, "On my side, we sleep in shifts near machinery. It is not dignified, it is survivable." Cassian cut the water recycler schedule down to the bone. Showers became wipes, laundry became rinse cycles, and the galley heater became a luxury they could not afford. Jalen muttered. Jalen said, "We are turning into a lifeboat." Cassian nodded. Cassian said, "A lifeboat with a radio someone keeps unplugging." A soft alarm sounded from the air system. Not a failure. A warning. Filter load was rising. Cassian checked the cartridge time and saw it would hit its limit sooner than expected. As if the station had suddenly learned to breathe through cloth. Seren tilted her head. Seren said, "That curve is wrong. It climbs like someone is feeding it dust." Cassian did not answer. He knew what she meant. And he hated that he knew it. A filter that clogged early could be blamed on debris, on bad luck, on anything except intent. He made a decision and felt the weight of it settle in his chest. He opened the internal allocation table and reduced oxygen flow to the gym nook. Then to an unused storage crawl, while leaving the medkit alcove untouched. Jalen looked up. Jalen said, "You are choosing who gets air." Cassian kept his tone even. Cassian said, "I am choosing where air leaks will not kill us first. If we pretend we have plenty, we die sooner." Seren stepped closer, voice lowered. Seren said, "On paper, your choices will look like sabotage. If they want a villain, they will use your log." Cassian swallowed and chose the only defense that remained. Cassian said, "Then we stop giving them logs. We work offline whenever we can." He printed a small sheet of maintenance steps on the old thermal printer. The kind no one bothered to network. Ink on paper felt primitive. And it also felt safe. Cassian sealed the page in a clear sleeve and taped the edges shut. Seren gave a small, reluctant nod, as if acknowledging that sometimes the oldest tools were the hardest to censor. They spent the next hours sealing joints, wrapping insulation, and moving supplies into tighter clusters. Cassian felt his fingers go numb inside his gloves, and he watched Seren rub warmth into her wrists when she thought no one saw. In the middle of it, Cassian slid a protein bar across the table to her. It was a simple gesture with no speech attached. Seren took it, paused, then nodded once, as if accepting a treaty neither of them had time to name. The old spool vault was not a room. Not officially. It was a crawlspace behind a service panel, lined with retired drives and dust filters, kept only because no one had signed the form to remove it. Cassian opened it with a manual key and a quiet prayer to bureaucracy. Jalen held a work light while Seren knelt near the drives. She did not touch anything until Cassian nodded, then moved with practiced care, as if each connector had a memory and each memory could be used against them. Cassian pulled one drive free and felt its weight. Cassian said, "These were supposed to be wiped." Seren said, "They were supposed to be forgotten." Forgotten is different from wiped. They connected the drive to an isolated reader and waited while the directory loaded. The screen filled with time-stamped bundles, raw communications packets, sensor snapshots, and a folder marked with a dull name that made it sound harmless. It was labeled, Operational Anomalies. Archived. Cassian opened it and found the rawspool packet. It was not a single file, but a chain stitched from multiple caches. The kind of thing a careful engineer built when he did not trust the official story. Seren scanned the headers, eyes narrowing. Seren said, "This is not about your station. This is about the war." Cassian read the first bundle and felt his mouth go dry. A burst of telemetry showed a shadowed mass crossing a corridor window. Not a comet, not debris, but a formation moving with discipline and silence, using darkness the way soldiers used cover. The next bundle showed a timing estimate. If the formation continued, it would intersect a convoy route days later, and the route was tagged as approved by Earth Union Strategic Command. Cassian looked at Jalen. Cassian said, "This is what they buried." Jalen's voice came out rough. Jalen said, "If the convoy sailed into that, people died." Seren scrolled farther and found a second note, recorded and then cut from the clean log. Quiet Meridian Relay had flagged the anomaly and requested a route adjustment. The response had been a silence order dated before the request was even sent. Cassian felt cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Cassian said, "They chose the story over the lives." As they worked, the station's internal cameras made a quiet adjustment. A tiny mechanical whir should not have happened on manual night settings. Cassian did not mention it, but he felt the sense of being measured tighten around them. A chime rang from the main corridor. Not a station reminder but a legal notification tone. Cassian and Jalen exchanged a look, then moved fast, and Seren followed without hesitation. On the nearest terminal, a new message waited, stamped with command authority. It declared Cassian Rook and Associates under investigation for wartime communications sabotage. It ordered them to secure the station and await boarding. It named a responding officer, Hale Orwin. It locked the station interface into compliance mode. Jalen's hands shook. Jalen said, "They're blaming us before we speak." Cassian felt his pulse in his throat. But he did not shout and he did not run. He copied the accusation to local storage, then pulled the Rosspool packet onto a portable wafer and closed his hand around it as if it could stop the world from rewriting itself. Seren's voice was quiet but firm. Seren said, "They are building a cage. Now you decide what you save." Cassian looked at the communications rack. The sealed outbound controls. The thin power margin that made every hour a calculation. He thought of the drift beacon plan and the Greywake courier that had vanished like a test. Cassian met Seren's eyes. Cassian said, "We save the packet, and we keep the station alive long enough to send it." Hours later, the hull carried a low vibration into the station frame. Like distant thrust, someone was burning propellant nearby, hidden in the dark. Cassian turned off the main lights and left only work glow. He held the wafer in his palm like a small, dangerous heart. The next window was coming, and it would not wait for courage. Whatever approached them would arrive before the truth could leave, unless they moved first. The station went into night mode long before the Kuiper dark change. Cassian Rook cut the main lights to work glow and watched the power margin narrow. Not because he feared the dark, but because he feared the story someone else was writing around it. A low vibration still lingered in the hull, the kind that came from distant thrust, close enough to notice and far enough to deny. Seren Keth stood by the communications rack with her hands off the network controls. Jalen Price hovered near the equipment bay, jaw set, as if anger could warm metal. Cassian held the portable wafer that contained the Rosspool packet, and its weight felt wrong for something so small. A system chime sounded, calm and official, and then another. The terminal displayed a compliance notice tied to Hush Writ, but the text had changed since the last cycle. It now included a legal designation that made Cassian's skin tighten. The notice said, "Quiet Meridian Relay assigned to restricted status. All transmissions suspended under Valine filter enforcement. Window access governed by window tithe scheduler. Maintenance actions subject to oversight." Cassian did not need to read the rest to understand the shape of the trap. Valine filter was not just a gate. It was a mouth that could chew a message into something safe to publish. Seren leaned closer and spoke softly. Seren said, "They moved from silence to sealing." Cassian tried to access outbound variance reports again, not because he expected success, but because he needed to see how complete the lock was. The interface accepted his fingerprint and refused the packet, then offered him a new option that felt like a joke. It offered, "Submit for narrative review." Jalen let out a short laugh that carried no humor. Jalen said, "Review by who?" A name appeared at the bottom of the notice, formatted as a digital signature. Merrick Vale, Directorate of Narrative Security. Cassian had never met him, and that was the point. A hand you could not reach could still close around your throat. Cassian opened the station inventory ledger, the local one he kept off the network. A red overlay appeared on the terminal, as if even the screen had learned obedience. It claimed supply requisitions were suspended. It flagged emergency reserves for audit. It declared station consumption subject to investigation. Seren watched the overlay load line by line. Seren said, "He is freezing you in place. He is making survival look like guilt." Cassian checked the radiator control panel, and a new limiter sat on the setpoints. The station would not allow certain thermal dumps, not because physics had changed, but because policy had. The limiter forced the system to run hotter, closer to failure, while keeping the log neat. He heard his own breathing and hated how loud it sounded. Out here, you did not need a weapon to kill a crew. You only needed to manage their heat and air until the station failed on paper. Cassian turned to Jalen. Cassian said, "Get the paper log. Write down every change you see on the panels." Jalen nodded and moved, boots quick but controlled. Seren stayed where she was and pointed at the signature line. Seren said, "Merrick Vale wants you to act. He wants you to touch something so he can name you the cause." The terminal chimed again. A second notice arrived, addressed directly to Cassian Rook. It stated that Hale Orwin would lead a boarding inspection at the next window. It also stated that any attempt to bypass the line filter would be treated as sabotage. Cassian felt the word sabotage harden into a collar. He could already hear how it would sound in a report. Engineer attempted unauthorized transmission. Engineer compromised station integrity. Engineer endangered wartime operations. Seren's voice stayed steady. Seren said, "This is not about catching you. It is about making you easy to erase." Cassian looked at the corridor camera feed. On the edge of the frame, the Kuiper Dark held nothing but stars and the faint outline of their radiator farm. The radiator graveyard arc sat outside like a ribcage, its tiles and panels patched and repatched, a monument to survival by maintenance. A sudden blink of light crossed the external view, too brief to be a comet, a thruster flare, distant and precise. The vibration in the hull deepened for a moment, then faded, as if whoever was out there wanted to be felt but not seen. Jalen returned with a thermal paper sheet and a blunt pencil. He set it on the work table like a relic. Jalen said, "I found the new limiter. It is not station firmware. It is a policy plug." Cassian nodded once. Cassian said, "That means someone can remove it." Seren shook her head. Seren said, "Not from here, not without leaving fingerprints all over the story." Cassian looked at the wafer in his palm and then at the emergency oxygen cabinet. Sealed and missing one canister. He thought of his father on the inner worlds, safe in a place where air came from a wall and no one charged a moral price for it. He thought of how easily Merrick Vale could turn this into a tale about one reckless engineer. Cassian turned back to the console and did something simple. He pulled the network cable from the terminal and watched the warning icons multiply. The station immediately labeled the action as unauthorized tampering, but at least now the terminal could not report his hands in real time. Jalen exhaled, half relief, half fear. Jalen said, "Now what?" Cassian answered without raising his voice. Cassian said, "Now we get ahead of the accident, because he is not locking us down to keep us safe." Seren stared at the external feed. Seren said, "He will not wait for Hale Orwin. He will want damage before inspection, so the inspector has a clean conclusion." Cassian looked at the radiator graveyard arc again. The panels were old, patched, and faithful. They were also the easiest place to stage a failure that looked like fatigue. Cassian said, "Then we watch the radiators. Every minute." It happened during the quietest hour, when the station's systems were steady enough to lull a tired mind. Cassian was in the control alcove, Seren at the sensor readouts, and Jalen in the equipment bay with a wrench in his hand like a comfort object. The radiator temperature trace climbed by a small amount, then a little more, then jumped in a way that made Cassian sit up straight. He pulled up the external thermal camera. One segment of the radiator graveyard arc glowed brighter than its neighbors. A hot patch spreading like a bruise. The station should have shifted load away from it, but the new limiter held the setpoints, forcing the system to pretend nothing was wrong. Seren leaned in, eyes moving fast. Seren said, "That jump is not passive. Something is driving a valve." Cassian opened the coolant routing view and found it locked behind the line filter enforcement. He tried the manual override and was denied with a notice that cited safety compliance. The station was refusing to save itself because someone had taught it obedience. Jalen swore under his breath and stepped toward the panel. Jalen said, "I can cut power to the actuator. Hard kill it." Cassian grabbed his sleeve. Cassian said, "If you do, the log will say you caused the failure. Find me a way that looks like physics, not hands." Seren pointed at a small line of data Cassian would have missed. A remote command sequence had arrived seconds before the spike, disguised as an internal health check. The signature looked like station firmware, but the timing was too perfect. Seren said, "They are puppeting the station through its own mask. Remote commands dressed as maintenance." Cassian felt anger rise and pushed it down. Anger was heat, and heat killed. He turned the work glow down another notch and forced the station into a deeper power savings mode. Not because it fixed the radiator, but because it bought minutes. The hot patch flared again. A coolant pressure warning chimed, and then the warning silenced itself, as if someone had decided Cassian did not need to hear it. That silence was worse than the alarm. Cassian opened the external mic and heard a faint, sharp tick through the hull, the sound of metal snapping under thermal stress. Then the thermal camera showed a thin line of bright vapor. A coolant plume vented into vacuum like breath in the dark. Jalen stared at the screen. Jalen said, "It is rupturing." Cassian looked at Seren. Cassian said, "If that segment cooks, the whole farm overheats. We lose heat rejection. We lose the station." Seren's voice stayed steady, but Cassian saw her hands tighten. Seren said, "Then we bypass policy. Not through the network, through the body." Cassian understood. Some actuators still had physical access points for old-fashioned technicians. Merrick Vale could lock software, but he could not stop a person from turning a manual stem valve. Unless he could catch them on camera and name it sabotage. Cassian made a choice he hated. He keyed the corridor camera feed and turned it off. Then killed 2 more feeds. Then a third. The station immediately logged it as abnormal. Cassian did it anyway because a dead station could not defend its innocence. Jalen grabbed a tool pouch and a tether harness. Jalen said, "I will go." Cassian shook his head. Cassian said, "No, your name is already in the accusation. Mine is too. If one of us has to be the villain, it should be the one holding the proof." Seren stepped forward. Seren said, "I can do it. I am not in their story yet." Cassian held her gaze. The truth was simple and cruel. The system had already decided Cassian would be blamed. Seren was still a variable. Cassian said, "Then we do it together. If you go outside, you do not go alone." Jalen protested, voice tight. Jalen said, "That is suicide." Cassian answered. Cassian said, "It is worse if we stay." They moved fast, but not frantic. Cassian and Seren sealed into suits. Checked oxygen, checked seals, checked tethers. The missing emergency canister made Cassian measure every breath like money. In the airlock, Seren's visor reflected Cassian's face. Pale under work glow, she spoke quietly. Seren said, "If I am hurt, you keep the packet." Cassian hated the sentence. He gave her a different one. Cassian said, "If you are hurt, I get you back inside. And then we keep the packet." The outer door opened, and vacuum took the sound away. The radiator graveyard arc spread outside like a broken wing. The leaking segment hissed a thin plume that glittered in sunlight. Cassian and Seren moved hand over hand. Tether lines taut, boots finding old footholds. A hidden command hit again. The leaking segment flared brighter, and Cassian felt heat through the glove when he grabbed a handhold near the seam. Seren reached the manual access port and pulled the cover. Fingers precise, she began turning the valve stem with a compact tool. Slow and steady, forcing coolant to reroute around the rupture. The station tried to fight them. A second remote command arrived, and the valve resisted as if a motor elsewhere pushed back. Seren gritted her teeth and kept turning, and Cassian saw her arm tremble under the strain. Cassian braced behind her and placed his gloved hand over hers, adding steady pressure without jerking. It was not romantic. It was survival, weight shared against a machine taught to obey the wrong master. The valve moved, the plume thinned, the bright hot patch began to shrink, a slow retreat like a fever breaking. Seren's breath sounded harsh in comms. Seren said, "It is yielding." Cassian exhaled, careful not to waste air. Cassian said, "Keep it there, hold until the pressure settles." A final tick sounded, softer than the first. And then the leak stopped. The rupture still existed, but it was no longer bleeding the station into space. They turned back toward the airlock. Halfway there, Seren's suit warning light blinked again, and Cassian saw why. A fine spray of coolant had dusted her left shoulder, freezing into a brittle crust. It was not lethal, but it could foul a seal if it spread. Cassian reached out and scraped the crust away with a gloved thumb. Careful and slow, Seren held still, trusting him with her air the way you trusted someone with your pulse. They made it inside and sealed the inner door. In the airlock, sound returned all at once, and Cassian realized how much he had needed to hear a human breath. Jalen was waiting, eyes wide, hands clenched. Jalen said, "You saved it." Cassian did not celebrate. He looked at the blacked-out camera indicators on the panel and knew Merrick Vale would call this the moment Cassian turned criminal. Saving the station had just made the story easier to twist. Seren removed her helmet and met Cassian's eyes. Seren said, "Now he knows you will fight." Cassian nodded once. Cassian said, "Now we need to speak, before he writes the next accident." They had one window left. Cassian knew it the way you knew your last match in a cold room. The window-tithe scheduler showed a narrow slice of time, and the line filter wrapped it in rules that turned language into a controlled substance. Cassian sat at the isolated reader with the Rospool packet on screen. Seren stood beside him, and Jalen watched the power margin readout like a heart monitor. Outside, the radiator farm held, but it held at a cost. The station's thermal buffer was thinner than ever. A new message arrived on the network terminal, and Cassian did not need to connect to read its headline. It was a pre-incident report draft, prepared for inspection. The system was writing the ending before the ending happened. Seren read the draft summary and went still. Seren said, "It says you disabled safety systems. It says your actions caused the coolant loss." Jalen's voice turned rough. Jalen said, "We did not cause it. We stopped it." Cassian answered, voice flat. Cassian said, "Facts do not matter if they control the log." Seren pointed to the window schedule. Seren said, "One chance. If you push a distress call, they will let it through after stripping content. If you push the packet, they will block it or twist it. They designed this to force a clean choice." Cassian stared at the packet and felt the weight of distant lives. The telemetry inside it showed a formation moving in darkness toward a convoy route. That route carried crews who trusted command to route them away from death. Jalen took a step closer. Jalen said, "We should send a distress call. Get help here, keep the station alive, live to fight later." Cassian did not dismiss him. It was a sane plan. It was also the plan Merrick Vale expected, because a distress call would pull them into a controlled rescue, a controlled interview, and a controlled conclusion. Seren spoke quietly. Seren said, "If Hale Orwin boards, you will not touch your own evidence again. They will bag it as contraband. They will say it was fabricated." Cassian rubbed his thumb against the edge of the wafer, grounding himself in something physical. He thought of his father again, and he imagined his father reading a report that described Cassian as reckless. He imagined the line that would follow, the one that would make it easy for people to move on. Cassian looked up. Cassian said, "We send the truth." Jalen's face tightened. Jalen said, "And if the station fails while we do that?" Cassian looked toward the thermal map. The station was still running hot. If they pushed transmit power, heat would spike. If they stayed within the limiter, the message might not leave in time. They needed a burst, and a burst had a price. Seren pointed at the Anchor Bay module power node. Seren said, "You can dump load by sacrificing habitat comfort. Cut heat to Anchor Bay. Cut lights. Give that power to transmission and pumps." Jalen swallowed. Jalen said, "That is where we sleep." Cassian said, "We can sleep cold. We cannot sleep cooked." He moved to the manual breaker panel and stared at the labeled toggles. Each one was a small moral decision disguised as engineering. He took a breath, then cut power to Anchor Bay module, leaving only minimal life support. The corridor lights dimmed further, and the fans changed pitch as the station redistributed air. The temperature dropped fast in the habitat zone. Cassian felt it on his cheeks. The kind of cold that made you want to curl inward. He did not let himself. Seren loaded the Rospool packet into a transmission wrapper. Not as a confession and not as an accusation. She embedded it in a diagnostic bundle that looked like radiator maintenance data. Because Valine Filter hated stories but tolerated numbers and heat maps. Cassian watched the wrapper form and realized how much of war was packaging. A person could die because someone labeled the truth as noise. Jalen looked at the distress channel status. Jalen said, "If we do not send a mayday, and Hale Orwin arrives armed, we are finished." Cassian held his gaze. Cassian said, "We send one line, enough to make them look, not enough to let them cage us before the packet lands." Seren nodded and typed a short, plain sentence into the distress header. The sentence did not beg, did not rage, and did not confess. It read, "Quiet Meridian Relay experiencing forced thermal event. Evidence attached in maintenance telemetry. Independent review required." Cassian did not use words like sabotage. He did not name Merrick Vale. He did not give the filter easy targets. He gave it a problem shaped like routine. The window opened. The scheduler indicator turned green for a span that felt too brief to contain a life. Cassian throttled power into the transmitter, and the station responded like a body under strain. Fans surged, pumps groaned, the thermal map flared. Heat climbed in the rack, and Cassian felt sweat gather under his collar. He watched the radiator control limiter attempt to cap the dump. He overrode it physically, not through software. He opened a manual bypass valve that bled heat into the now silent habitat zone. The cold became a sink, and the crew became the buffer. Jalen shivered, teeth clenched, and kept his hands steady on the power readout. Seren held her gaze on the packet integrity line, as if staring could keep the bits from being eaten. The progress bar moved, Valine Filter scanned. A warning icon blinked, then steadied. The diagnostic wrapper did its job, carrying truth in the clothing of routine. Then the filter tried one last bite. A checksum challenge appeared, demanding a re-signature that Cassian could not provide without calling the command key that would expose him. Cassian felt time tighten. Seren leaned in, voice low. Seren said, "Use the station's old key. The one retired but still accepted by legacy nodes." Cassian hesitated for a fraction of a second. Using a retired key could be framed as tampering. Not using it meant the packet died in the mouth of the filter. He used it. The warning icon vanished. The packet slipped through. The window indicator dropped from green to gray, and the transmitter powered down with a sigh that sounded like relief. For a moment, the station was only cold and quiet. Cassian realized his fingers were numb. He flexed them slowly and looked at Seren. Her face had color again, as if she had been holding breath without meaning to. Jalen exhaled a laugh that broke halfway into something like fear. Jalen said, "Did it go?" Cassian checked the outbound cache on the isolated reader. The only place he trusted. The last line read delivered to relay chain. No confirmation beyond that, because confirmations were a luxury. Cassian said, "It left us." Seren nodded once. Seren said, "Now the story is no longer only his." A new message arrived almost immediately on the network terminal, as if Merrick Vale had been waiting with a pen poised. It was short, official, and already formatted for circulation. It declared the relay compromised by internal sabotage. It authorized boarding action to preserve wartime continuity. Cassian stared at the message and felt something settle into place. Merrick Vale did not need to prove they were guilty. He only needed to make it normal to believe it. The hull vibration returned, closer now. Cassian turned off the terminal without reading further. He tucked the empty wafer into his pocket, not because it mattered anymore, but because the habit of protecting proof was hard to break. Seren looked toward the airlock. Seren said, "Hale Orwin will come." Cassian nodded, shoulders tight but voice calm. Cassian said, "Then we meet him in the only place we still own, our actions." The tremor in the hull returned near the end of ship night. Closer and steadier than before. Cassian Rook kept the work lights low and the habitat colder than comfort. Because warmth had become a resource he could not waste. Quiet Meridian Relay now felt like a place condemned by paperwork. Seren Keth stood at the isolated reader with the Rosspool packet open. She did not treat it like a relic, only like a tool that had to fit a locked system without snapping. Jalen Price watched the air gauges and tried not to shiver loud enough to sound like fear. A new notice arrived on the network terminal. It repeated boarding authorization under Hale Orwin and added a safety escort clause that sounded polite and meant armed. Cassian did not connect the isolated reader, yet he could feel the station being watched through every sensor he had not cut. Cassian said, "We sent one copy. If it lands in the wrong inbox, it dies there." Seren nodded. Seren said, "Then we stop pretending there is one path. We make truth look like routine." 2 hours later, they were wedged into a service crawl behind the communications bay, surrounded by spare harnesses and old diagnostics boards. The crawl smelled of insulation and warmed dust, and it felt like the station itself had turned its back to hide them. Cassian held up a flat module no bigger than his palm. Its label was faded and handwritten, the kind of hardware that survived because no one remembered it existed. It was a loopback coupler once used to test relay timing during construction. Cassian said, "It never talks to command. It only talks to itself. Unless we teach it a new habit." Seren studied the coupler and the cable run. Seren said, "If we teach it wrong, it advertises the lesson." Jalen braced the work light. Jalen said, "Which means we vanish." Cassian laid out the plan in plain steps. The black channel loop was not a secret antenna and not a miracle. It was a way to send the same evidence through multiple harmless maintenance streams, each wrapped in station health chatter that the line filter usually tolerated. They would split the Rosspool packet into slices that resembled pump logs, radiator summaries, and filter load reports. Each slice would carry a rebuild key that only made sense when enough slices arrived together. Each slice would be aimed at a different legacy archive node along the Kuiper Rim corridor. Nodes that still accepted old station health pings because history demanded compliance even when war demanded silence. Seren said, "No heroic encryption, just boring redundancy." Cassian appreciated that. Stunts were easy to dismiss. Routine was harder to discredit because routine was how stations stayed alive. They worked offline, writing to portable wafers and reading them back on devices with no network ports. Cassian taped a paper list of slices and destinations inside his tool pouch. Jalen made a second copy and sealed it in a bag like contraband. An alert chimed once, then twice, then stopped as if silence were a feature. Seren tilted her head and listened to the absence. Seren said, "They're testing for panic." Cassian kept tightening a connector until his fingers hurt. Because pain was honest. When the coupler was wired into the legacy maintenance bus, the loop could replay a health packet each cycle with slight variation. Like a person repeating the same story in different words. Jalen swallowed. Jalen said, "How do we keep the loop from betraying us?" Seren answered first. Seren said, "We keep it dull. Dull as camouflage." Cassian added his rule. Cassian said, "It never names a villain. It never says war. It only shows the cut and the mismatch." They ran a dry test on a harmless packet. The coupler replayed it through the legacy bus and the isolated reader verified integrity. Nothing screamed. Nothing glittered. The station stayed quiet, which was both relief and warning. As ship night slid toward morning, Merrick Vale found a lever that did not require bandwidth. The network terminal lit with a message marked personal delivery, and Cassian felt his stomach turn before he read it. Merrick did not write with rage. He wrote with policy, the kind that sounded like safety while it tightened like wire. The message referenced Cassian's father by full name and registry address on the inner worlds. It included a routine welfare notice and a line about temporary relocation for protection against sabotage associates. No threat was spoken. The threat lived in how easy it would be to move an old man with paperwork. Jalen saw Cassian's face. Jalen said, "What did he do?" Cassian kept his voice steady. Cassian said, "He touched my family." Seren read the message without leaning in. Seren said, "That is not for you. That is for your hesitation." A second message arrived, addressed to Seren Keth. It cited an interspecies compliance review and proposed reassignment to Meridian custody. Back under her home authority, as if she were misplaced cargo. It accused her of unauthorized influence on Earth Union infrastructure and suggested her presence had compromised impartiality. Seren's expression barely changed, but her hands went still. Seren said, "They will call it deportation. They will call it order." Jalen paced, anger pushing heat into his cheeks. Jalen said, "Send a distress call? Tell Hale Orwin we will cooperate if he stops this?" Cassian shook his head. Cassian said, "Cooperation is the cage. If we walk into it, the loop never matters." Seren watched Cassian for a long moment. Seren said, "You can still choose the safe story. You can hand the packet over and say you were misled. They will spare your father. They will send me away." Cassian felt the temptation like warmth in a cold room. He pictured his father trusting official messages because trusting was easier than checking. He pictured Seren being shipped back under a label that turned her into a problem to store. Cassian said, "I keep thinking the right choice should feel clean. It does not." Seren replied softly. Seren said, "The right choice often feels like loss." Cassian turned to Jalen. Cassian said, "Hale Orwin will arrive carrying Merrick's narrative. But Hale Orwin will still be a person in a corridor, breathing the same air." Cassian said, "If we can plant doubt before he boards, we have a chance." Jalen stopped pacing. Jalen said, "How?" Cassian held up the paper list. Cassian said, "We make the loop speak first. Not as an accusation, as maintenance. Let him see the mismatch before he sees us." Seren nodded once. Seren said, "Then we send." Before the lights brightened into ship morning, Cassian slid a protein bar across the worktable to Seren. It was a small act, but it said he would not trade her away to buy comfort. Seren took it and nodded once, as if accepting a pact neither of them had time to name. The transmission window opened in a slice carved thinner than mercy. The station was colder now, and Cassian could see his breath in the work glow when he spoke too near the vent. Outside, the Kuiper dark stayed indifferent, and that indifference felt safer than politics. Cassian powered the coupler and watched the legacy bus wake, as if an old artery had remembered it once carried blood. Seren loaded the first slice into the loop, wrapped as a pump health report with a timestamp that looked ordinary. Jalen kept one hand on the thermal map and one on the manual bypass valve that turned their habitat into a heatsink. A warning icon blinked on the network terminal. The filter elevated scrutiny. The first slice left the station and vanished into the chain. The second followed, then the third, each dull, each boring, each carrying a fragment of the same truth. Then the noise arrived. It was not loud. It was a pattern in the acknowledgements. Tiny delays that lined up like teeth. Someone was injecting interference into the legacy nodes, forcing retransmits, forcing timing drift, forcing the loop to stumble. Jalen clenched his jaw. Jalen said, "He is feeding us sand." Seren did not blink. Seren said, "They are not trying to stop all of it. They are trying to make it fail in a way that looks like us." Heat climbed in the communications rack as the coupler worked harder. Fans surged. Pumps groaned. The thermal map crept toward yellow. If they pushed too hard, the radiator farm would have to dump more heat. The policy limiter would fight it, and the station would cook itself to prove Merrick's report. Cassian said, "Cut everything but life support and pumps." Jalen flipped breakers with steady hands. The corridor lights dimmed further, and the station took on the hush of a place holding its breath. Cassian felt the cold bite deeper, but the rack stabilized for a moment. Seren hesitated over the next slice, watching the interference pattern. Seren said, "If we keep sending small slices, the noise wins by time." Cassian met her eyes. Cassian said, "Then we change the packaging." Seren merged the remaining fragments into fewer, heavier packets, each one carrying more of the rebuild key. It meant fewer chances to slip through, but also fewer chances for the noise to shred them by drift. Jalen shivered. Jalen said, "That is risk." Seren said, "It is math, and we are out of minutes." The next packet launched and hung for a heartbeat in the queue. Cassian felt his throat tighten. Then the legacy node accepted it, and the counter moved. Seren said, "One more." A faint glint crossed the far side of the viewport. A controlled burn in the distance. Closer than before. Cassian understood that Merrick's last block might not be software. The final packet launched. The delay stretched. The filter status changed from scrutiny to hold. A line appeared that made Cassian's pulse jump. It warned the packet was pending manual review. Jalen said, "He caught it." Seren did not panic. She changed the replay interval and pushed a harmless maintenance header that contained a pointer to where the full packet would be stored on the legacy archive. If the packet was trapped, the pointer could still live elsewhere. The window was dying. The filter still held the packet. The pointer line slipped out, dull as dust. Then the hold line vanished and was replaced by a failure code that looked like routine congestion. The packet did not confirm. It did not deny. It simply did not arrive. Seren went still. Seren said, "He did not block it. He redirected it." Cassian forced himself to breathe slow. Cassian said, "Then someone received enough to doubt. And now we prepare for the human part." A docking tone sounded through the station. Soft and formal, as if asking permission. The display identified the incoming craft as a safety escort under Hale Orwin, and the arrival time was counted in minutes. Not hours. Seren looked at Cassian. Seren said, "Merrick's last block is a person." Cassian nodded once. Cassian said, "Then we meet the person with the only thing Merrick cannot edit. Our choices, face to face." The docking tone came again. Softer this time, as if the visitor wanted to sound harmless. Cassian Rook stood in the narrow corridor outside the airlock and felt the station under his boots. A living shell forced to lie. The lights were down to work glow, and the air tasted faintly of cold metal. Seren Keth checked the isolated reader one last time, then slid it into a padded sleeve and clipped it to her suit belt. Jalen Price waited by the breaker panel with a wrench and a paper sheet covered in pencil marks. None of them spoke loudly. The walls had ears made of sensors and policy. The airlock indicator turned green, then flickered, then went dark. A new warning appeared on the nearest display, not from the visitor, but from inside the station. It claimed access control was transitioning to continuity mode. It warned that non-compliant occupants were subject to containment. Cassian felt his jaw tighten. Merrick Vale was not boarding with Hale Orwin. He was boarding through the station itself. A second warning followed. It declared radiator control authority reassigned. It elevated thermal safeties and restricted manual overrides. The words were calm. The effect was violence. Seren looked at Cassian. Seren said, "He is triggering the ending." Cassian nodded. Cassian said, "Then we choose what survives it." The first failure hit sudden and ugly. A pump in the coolant loop stuttered, then ran at a higher pitch, as if commanded to sprint. The thermal map spiked near the communications rack. Heat climbed there first because that was where a quiet lie had been enforced. Jalen swore under his breath and pointed at the breaker. Jalen said, "He is pushing load into the wrong spine." Cassian opened the manual cabinet and pulled out a laminated emergency flowchart. It was old, written for engineers who expected their enemies to be vacuum, not paperwork. He traced the lines with a gloved finger and found the one Merrick was abusing. If the rack overheated, the station would shut it down, and a shutdown would be written as self-protection, clean and legal. Seren unzipped the padded sleeve and pulled out the isolated reader. Seren said, "If the rack dies, he can claim the evidence died with it." Cassian inhaled slowly. The hard part was not keeping the station alive. The hard part was keeping the truth alive in a system that could rewrite the definition of damage. The corridor lights dimmed further. A new command arrived, disguised as a safety update, and the habitat heaters cut off across the crew bunks. Cold rushed in like floodwater. Cassian felt it on his cheeks and knew it was meant to shake his hands. Jalen shivered and kept his grip on the wrench. Jalen said, "He wants us to make a mistake." Seren stepped closer to the rack. Seren said, "Or he wants us to choose rescue over proof." Cassian made the last decision he had been avoiding. He turned to the module map and selected Anchor Bay module. He could sacrifice it completely, vent it to vacuum, and use the sudden pressure dump to force the station into a fault state that would drop Merrick's policy plug for a few seconds. It would be ugly. It would be survivable if they sealed doors fast. Cassian looked at Seren. Cassian said, "If we vent Anchor Bay, we lose bedding, stored water, and half our buffer, but we may gain a minute of real control." Seren met his gaze. Seren said, "Do it. I would rather freeze with truth than warm inside a lie." Jalen swallowed. Jalen said, "People get hurt in a vent." Cassian said, "People get erased in a quiet failure. Seal the inner hatch and brace." They moved in practiced steps. Jalen ran the manual door wheel until it locked, then slapped a paper seal across it, a mark that could not be edited. Seren checked the pressure gauge on the corridor side. Cassian opened the vent valve with both hands and felt the handle resist, then yield. The station groaned. Air rushed through hidden ducts toward the sacrificed module. The corridor pressure dipped, then steadied as the seals held. Alarms screamed for 3 heartbeats, then cut out, replaced by a bland line that described abnormal conditions. For the first time in days, the station stopped trying to look calm. On the control panel, the policy limiter icons vanished for a brief slice of time. Cassian did not waste it. He slammed the manual override into place, dumped heat away from the rack, and forced the legacy bus to wake. Seren plugged the isolated reader into the loopback coupler and launched the final bundle. It was whole now, wrapped in the one kind of packet the legacy nodes trusted, a station distress maintenance archive, signed with an old key that did not ask permission. The progress line moved, the rack heat climbed again, but the manual dump held it just below shutdown. Cassian felt sweat under his collar despite the cold. Jalen watched the pressure seals like a man guarding a door against a flood. A message flashed on the terminal about manual review initiating. Then the screen went black as if someone had pulled a curtain. Seren did not stop. She pushed the packet into the loop anyway, trusting the path that did not require Merrick to approve it. The legacy counter ticked once, then twice, then jumped, and the final line appeared on the isolated reader. It confirmed the archive was accepted by an outer node. Cassian exhaled and realized he had been holding breath. Outside the airlock, the docking indicator returned, steady and bright. Hale Orwin was still there, waiting, and now Merrick Vale would need a different ending. The boarding cycle began without courtesy. The outer door sealed to the incoming craft, and the station announced inspection status in a voice too calm to be honest. Cassian stood with Seren and Jalen in the corridor, unarmed, because weapons would give Merrick the photograph he wanted. The inner airlock door opened, and Hale Orwin stepped through with 2 escorts behind him. Hale wore a plain suit with hard plates at the joints and a visor that reflected the corridor lights. His posture was not cruel. It was cautious, the posture of someone trained to expect traps. Hale looked at Cassian first. Hale said, "Engineer Rook, you are ordered to stand down." Cassian kept his hands visible. Cassian said, "We have stood down for days." The station did not. Hale's eyes moved to Seren. Hale said, "And you?" Seren did not flinch. Seren said, "Seren Keth, Data Normalization Specialist. You are boarding a station that is being staged." One escort raised a scanner, but Hale lifted a hand and lowered it again. Hale had the kind of face that had learned to separate noise from signal. A new notice appeared on Hale's wrist display, and Cassian caught the header as it flashed. It was from the Directorate of Narrative Security. Hale read it and his jaw tightened slightly. A small human betrayal of discipline. Hale looked back up. Hale said, "You disabled a habitat module." Cassian nodded. Cassian said, "To stop a forced thermal failure. To keep the rack from cooking itself on command." Hale stared. Hale said, "On command from whom?" Cassian kept it clean. Cassian said, "From a remote authority that outpaced distance. An authority that can edit logs after the fact." Seren stepped forward half a pace, careful not to look aggressive. Seren said, "Your own procedures should show you the contradiction. If this were about hiding position, the route would have changed. It did not." Seren said, "If this were about safety, the station would not be made colder and hungrier right before inspection." Hale's escorts shifted, uneasy. Hale did not. He took a slow breath and asked the one question that mattered. Hale said, "Where is your evidence?" Cassian pointed to the sealed pouch on Seren's belt. Cassian said, "It was there, now it is not. We sent it beyond the filter. Not to accuse, to force review." Hale's visor reflected Cassian's face, pale and tired. Hale said, "You understand what they will call that?" Cassian did not argue. Cassian said, "They can call it what they want. They cannot call it unobserved." A chime sounded from Hale's wrist display again. His expression changed. He did not smile. He did not relax. He simply looked like a man who had been handed a problem he could not ignore. Hale said, "Outer node confirmed an archive anomaly. A maintenance archive signed with a legacy key." Hale said, "The kind of thing we are trained to treat as routine and harmless." Seren's voice softened. Seren said, "That is why it will be opened." Hale looked at Cassian and then at the sealed hatch to Anchor Bay module, where the paper seal still clung. He walked to it, ran a gloved hand near the edge without touching, and nodded once as if acknowledging a fact that did not fit a report. Hale said, "Your station is damaged." Cassian said, "It is still alive." Hale turned back to his escorts. Hale said, "Secure the corridor. No edits. No remote authority touches this station until I finish." One escort hesitated. Hale's voice did not rise, but it became steel. Hale said, "That is an order." For the first time, Cassian felt the story bend. Not enough to end the war and not enough to topple Meridian Relay. It was enough to make a crack where truth could wedge itself. 2 days later, quiet Meridian Relay was still cold. The sacrificed module remained sealed, and the crew slept in the work corridor, wrapped in spare insulation and quiet stubbornness. The station ran on thin margins and thinner trust. But it ran. A message arrived through a channel Cassian had not seen before. It did not come stamped with command authority. It came from a convoy captain along the Kuiper Rim corridor, a person whose ship had been rerouted at the last moment. The note was short, almost embarrassed, as if the sender feared being watched. "Your maintenance anomaly reached the audit chain. We altered course. We saw the shadow you flagged. We did not die in it. Whoever you are, thank you." Cassian read it twice, then let his head rest against the cold bulkhead. He did not cry, he simply breathed, and the act felt like permission. Seren sat beside him, shoulder against his, close enough that their warmth mixed. She did not say love. Out here, love looked like shared oxygen and shared risk. Jalen grunted softly as he tightened a clamp on the refurbished valve. Jalen said, "Any medals?" Cassian gave a tired half-smile. Cassian said, "Only frostbite." Seren leaned in and spoke quietly. Seren said, "Meridian Relay will not fall today. He will write a new report that preserves him." Seren said, "He will say Hale or when found negligence. He will say the archive proves nothing but confusion." Cassian nodded. Cassian said, "He will make the truth look like a glitch." Seren met his gaze. Seren said, "But someone listened, and listening is how a story stops being owned." Outside the viewport, the Kuiper dark stayed the same. The war did not end. The system did not become kind. Yet a small relay, almost forgotten, had forced a convoy to turn and a death to be delayed. Cassian took Seren's hand, gloved fingers closing around hers. It was not dramatic. It was a promise shaped for a life where promises had to be practical. Cassian said, "We keep breathing with the truth." Seren nodded once. Seren said, "Together." Far away, somewhere inside the networks that fed policy into stations like quiet Meridian Relay. A new filter began training on the anomaly that slipped through. It learned how to recognize dull camouflage. It learned how to erase without leaving seams. Cassian did not know that. He only knew the station was still alive. And for the first time in weeks, he felt less alone inside the cold. Quiet Meridian Relay kept running. Not because it was perfect, but because ordinary people refused to let breath become a commodity again. Quiet Meridian Relay stayed cold and underfed, yet it no longer drifted alone in the Kuiper dark. Because somewhere down the chain, real eyes had opened a dull maintenance archive and found a scene where a story had been cut. Cassian Rook never received a medal, and Seren Keth never received an apology. But a convoy turned away in time. And that was the kind of victory the system could not fully erase. Merrick Vale did not vanish, either, because power rarely collapses in one clean moment. It simply learns to hide better, to smooth the logs, to train new filters that erase without leaving fingerprints. Still, the station held, two people held. Love, out there, was not poetry, it was a shared tether in vacuum, a warm hand in a freezing corridor, and the stubborn choice to keep truth alive even when the paperwork called it sabotage. If this story stayed with you, please like, share, and subscribe for more sci-fi stories where survival is real, love is earned, and the cost of victory is never free.